Morning.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. It looks like we've got most people come into the room now, but we have got Charlotte who will be looking after that and making sure anybody that's a couple of minutes late comes in. But we thought we better start on time because there's plenty of you here. So thank you very much for joining us this morning. My name's Lucy Truman. I'm the Managing Director and founder of Truman Change. We're a small management consultancy based in the Northwest, and we help public sector organisations, predominantly local government organisations, to make change happen and to do it as well as they possibly can. And the reason that we do that, the reason that I'm passionate about that is I'm very passionate about local government. It's my favourite sector to work in. It's incredibly diverse in terms of what it does. But also everybody that I talk to has got some sort of war story about change that has gone wrong, whether it just upset everybody or it cost too much money and didn't deliver anything. And I am convinced and I know that there is a better way of doing it. But we've had this incredible year, haven't we, where we've seen firsthand that change can happen extremely rapidly and in very different ways than we've seen it happen before. So last year we started doing a series of these conversations just to kind of explore it in the midst of the pandemic. And this is the first one of this year where we're now kind of starting to look at, so what's next? You know, how are local government organisations learning from what they've been through and what are they taking forward? So just from a housekeeping point of view, please do try and keep yourself on mute. If you do want to ask any questions, drop something in the chat and then we can unmute you and involve you in the conversation if you would like that. We are recording. We are intending to only show an audio rather than everybody, but we're still figuring out the technicalities of that, but we will be posting it on YouTube afterwards. So if you don't want to be seen, we will try and do it so that it's only showing the speakers, but if not, we'll do it as if it's a podcast. And we will be doing a couple of polls during the session as well, just to kind of get your feedback on what you're working on in your organisation. So that's what we're here for today. I've got three brilliant speakers who have given up their time for us today. So welcome to the speakers. We have Andrew Grant, who is an interim chief exec. He's an experienced chief exec in local government. He's worked at Aylesbury Vale and recently has been working for Cambridge City Council, who he's just very recently finished with. And we know Andrew, he's very passionate about digital transformation, and my goodness, haven't we seen a lot of this in the last kind of 12 to 18 months. And he joined Cambridge kind of 6 months into the pandemic, so was there very much for that, right in the midst of it, and then towards the end, that thinking what's next. We also have Beverly Tarker, and Beverly and I have worked together previously. Beverly's the Director of Adults and Health at Haringey Council. She's very passionate about kind of relationships-based change, and they're looking at the moment at strength-based work, changing their relationship with communities and looking at an organisational focus on change management, and is also very interested in reflecting on the difference in pace of change during the pandemic. And finally, we've got John Morrissey. John is the Director of Change and Organisational Development in Lancashire County Council. So we have a London, a county and somebody from a district city council. So we've got a real mix for you today. In case you can't tell by my accent, I am Lancashire based, born and bred here. I am half Yorkshire actually. My dad would be turning in his grave hearing me describe myself as Lancashire. John has been working 25 years in local government, recently with Lancashire, and initially during COVID was very much in the kind of emergency response place, but is now looking at what might be for the future for Lancashire. So we've got a real mix of people around the table today, and it's an informal session. We're just going to chew the fat, so do post any questions in the chat and we'll try and address them. But I just want to start really with a kind of, we'll just run a poll now, Charlotte, if we can, that first poll around what are people's kind of focuses and specific priorities on change at the moment. But while that comes up and everybody responds to that, Andrew, I'd like to come to you first, if that's okay, and just ask you, what are the priorities? So in your experience of working with Cambridge, what are their priorities around change at the moment?
Well, they've just gone through an election, so I ended up being RO. I've never stayed up 40 hours straight, I don't think, since my student days. So all those who've been returning officers will know that was quite an interesting postscript to the current pandemic, because I don't think we're clearly over. Their priorities: anti-poverty and climate change. But also, I added a third string during my time is looking at their medium-term financial plan, which is financial resilience, because it's very well having these sort of very strong policy drivers, and that's fantastic, and well endorsed by a very active and interested local resident base in the city from all different communities. But you've got to be a functioning local authority in order to enable these things. So I think the third strand was quite a heavy emphasis on change, but pretty significant efficiencies and changing the business model of the city council, which had didn't really do austerity. For some reason, the city council enjoyed quite a good whereas the rest of us were all in deep throes of austerity. I think with their land assets and growth, they survived up to COVID, but perhaps I'll come back to it. But COVID was a real bench pressure test of its financial resilience and its ability to serve. And I think now the future is how you blend quite strong out there external policy drivers, anti-poverty, housing, very important, but also the hard, possibly mucky yards of how you change the internal culture and become basically cost savings. For a Labour authority that doesn't really want to know about redundancies, how do you change the plane while flying the plane, which is my old change Mobius strip. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Andrew. And John, do you want to tell us a little bit about Lancashire? So I know it's a huge county. I know it's a lot of different diverse communities, and it's always a fascinating area for me because you've got parts of the area that are seaside towns, and you've got very rural places, you've got a couple of cities. So where do you start in terms of deciding what's driving change in an area so big?
Yeah, thanks, Lucy. And it's a fascinating place. I'd caveat that by saying that I've probably been into our HQ 6 times. And actually, by strange coincidence, Freddie, who's on the call at the moment, one of our members, at 2 of those times I've bumped into him in one of the offices. But apart from that, everything has been home-based, and that's been a huge change, delivered almost literally overnight. So that has been pretty enormous. In terms of priorities, when I landed a year ago last week, the priority was really clear, and that was about beginning our improvement journey. So we'd done a 13-week concept and shape phase with a consultancy partners, a blended team, and we were ready to go on that. But that was literally pretty much approved the week we went into lockdown. So we took the view, I think rightly, that the organisation wasn't ready to kick into that kind of transformation whilst we were dealing with the pandemic here and now. Having said that, through the past 12 months, we've achieved some huge change. So flexible working, as I said, rollout of Teams and 365, probably the biggest and fastest public sector rollout from Microsoft's view, and some really new and interesting ways of working with customers as well. But now we are emerging from COVID. Touch wood, as Andrew said, we're not clear yet, are we? But as we begin to emerge from the tunnel, I think probably some short, medium, and long-term priorities. Short-term, a big piece around agreeing and delivering our ways of working program, which is largely the kind of location, accommodation, work styles piece, but supported by a really big culture and performance engagement discussion. And embedding Teams and 365 into new working practices. What we've done largely, I think, is we've shifted our old ways of meeting and talking into a virtual space, but we've not really started to take advantage of all the different things that can offer us in terms of engagement. So I think a big piece around that. The here and now priority, the bit we're working on right now, is developing and agreeing and implementing a front door for change. We're really good, I think, in LCC, from what I've seen, at delivering change and improvement. And the organisation's had a really significant turnaround over the past few years. But we're not very good at prioritising so that we can ensure we allocate our increasingly scarce resources more effectively. So that's the real short-term piece. Longer term, the big piece for me is probably how we can work more effectively with our partners. I've got to say, moving to a 2-tier environment has been a huge learning curve. Coming from Unitaries and GM, that's really, really interesting. I think there's a lot we can do to build on the positives that we've got during COVID and the way that we've worked as a really wide group of partners, very collaboratively, to really take our partnership working on.
Thank you, John. And Beverly, I'm sure a lot of what Andrew and John have said already definitely resonates with Haringey. Do you want to tell us what you're working on at the moment? Or you're on mute, Beverly.
Apologies, I had to be one, didn't it? So thanks, Lucy. I think a lot of what Andrew and John has said has had real resonance. But I suppose what I would want to emphasise is that I think really Haringey has been on a journey of transformation for many years pre-COVID. There are so many change programmes. I think just from the times of austerity, go back to 2010, 2011. I think that was the impetus for us to all very much work very differently. And as the Director of Adults and Health, which covers adult social care, that has been an area that has been increasingly adversely impacted by austerity measures, as I'm sure everyone will be aware. But I think just painting the picture about Haringey in a wider sense, it is very much a borough of two halves. There's, in fact, in the east of the borough, we have nationally what is probably one of the most deprived wards in the country. And there is just something around, I think, our administration, when they first came in, really focused on equality and fairness as a driving force for transformation and change. And that has played out through the organisation. And with that has come some real sort of must-dos, which I fully embrace, about working very closely with communities, co-producing with our residents and supporting change from that sort of bottom-up way of working. It's fair to say that that is not consistent across the council, but I think there are some pockets of really good practice. And of course, then we had COVID and the COVID response, and what that has done is just unveiled a lot of what was already seated on the ground in terms of inequalities in the system. So one of our driving forces now is really, and it's a word I want to use instead of equalities, is equity. How do we actually rebuild and recover as we come through COVID as a system in a more equitable way? So there are a number of change programs ongoing at present within the council. And I think, and if you don't mind me mentioning Lucy, I first approached your organisation because there was something around a bit of chaos around these change programs and each part of the council doing things in their own way. And I wanted to have a specific focus on change management. So I think we're very good at identifying change programs. We're not very good on focusing on how we manage change. And some of the work or some of the outputs from the work that we've done together, I really have taken away to encourage and support wider conversations across the council. And what I'm currently trying to do is we've branded it as Haringey Connects, but I'm not that much into branding, but it forms a useful purpose in that we're trying to get corporately and with partners a consistent way of managing change and having that focus on change management with some really important principles. At the core of that, and you mentioned it in my introduction, is the sort of the focus on the residents and the relationships that we build with residents and our partners. And to use a few examples. So for example, I would say pre-COVID, certainly in my area of work, we had contact with our providers. I would say now we've got relationships with our providers that we're hoping to build on in terms of how we respond to the challenges going forward, certainly in the adult social care provider market. The information we have with residents through the sort of intensive community-based work in terms of our COVID response, I think is invaluable. It gives us a real foundation to build on. Place and localities working is very much at the centre of how we, as a vehicle for our change processes. And we feel that by being where our residents are within our localities, bringing together a program such as Connected Communities, where we invite individuals not to have to navigate a solid structure as a system, which we ourselves find really challenging, but we're there, multi-agencies, whether it's the DWP, local council, voluntary sector, health partners, within localities, within a community, so that you provide that platform for that improved interface with our residents and with our communities. And I would say, in summary, a focus on some of those principles of being present, being co-producing, a focus on what will be different as a result of listening to our residents and responding, both for our workforce and for our residents, is certainly a central focus of the work we're trying to do in Haringey. Thanks.
Thank you, Beverly. So we've had the poll results back, and we have a joint top answer, which is financial savings, culture change, and changes in ways of working. Although they are fairly evenly split, so it looks like there is definitely some commonality in terms of what people are focusing on at the moment, and I'm sure that those things do resonate with our speakers as well. I did just want to pick up on something that Beverly touched on there, which is around that whole kind of tendency I think large organisations have, and local government is they're all quite big organisations. They obviously vary in size, but they're all fairly big, fairly complex in terms of delivering lots of things. So I think there is this desire to create a lot of sort of discipline and project management around change, which, you know, as a project manager by trade, it's never a bad idea to have a plan and think about what you're doing before you start. I'm not suggesting we completely scrap it at all, but I do think one of the things that's interesting about change that happened during COVID was that we didn't have time to do those things, and we almost skipped some of the detailed planning, and we did focus on coming back to Beverly's statement about what will be different. And Beverly knows that's one of my favourite questions, to just keep harping on and on and on about what will actually be different. Let's focus on that. I'd be really interested to hear from yourselves, John and Andrew, in terms of how your approach has been, and how do you get that balance right of having the right amount of structure but also a focus on action and on people. John, can I come to you first?
Sure, yeah. I think that, I mean, that's been a really interesting area for me. So one of the challenges we face, I think, is retaining the pace and the flexibility that we've had during the past 15 months, whilst bringing some more focus, grip, prioritization. Prioritization during the pandemic was really easy in many ways, because it was the here and now. So I think, you know, in terms of the lessons we've learned, for me, the key thing is, if we put our minds to it, we can achieve pretty much anything. There isn't really an option anymore to say we can't do that, because we've proven over the past 15 months that in whatever massive challenge comes along, we've been able to respond to it. But I think the governance around our crisis response, so in Lancashire, that's about the SCG, the Strategic Coordinating Group, and a series of cells. I think that worked really well. We had strategic and tactical alignment. We had really rapid decision making. We had a great kind of shared intelligence picture and situational awareness and prioritization. So I think our governance needs to try and find ways to retain as much of that as we possibly can. And for me, one of the other big, it wasn't a revelation, because I've done a lot of work with the military in the past in terms of covenant, working with veterans, etc. But I've seen it even more at close hand from working with the MIL. I'm working with our blue light colleagues as well. Exactly how much we can learn from them going forward. I think I work really closely with our military colleagues. We developed the lateral flow testing program in Lancs that then rolled out across the UK. We had best part of 500 troops working alongside us, and I think their ability to analyze and plan and take decisive action in the middle of uncertainty has been incredible to watch. There's, in fact, just if you give me one moment, I was just going back through it this morning. There's a document they have which is called, it's one of their core documents, is the Doctrine and Combat Estimate document. And so you read the first bit of this paragraph and you think, well, that's classic military, isn't it? So they talk about why it's important, why this concept of integrated action is important. And they talk about integrated action being the coordinated application of lethal and non-lethal army capabilities across forces, partners and non-governmental parties. So that all sounds very macho and meathead and battle ready. But then they get onto the next piece. It says the purpose of integrated action is to change the behavior of others and to achieve successful outcomes. And that is exactly the purpose of our planning and delivery as well. So, you know, part of the challenge for me, I think, is how we will retain elements of that and really strengthen those analytical and planning approaches, because I think, you know, traditionally it's the stuff that's been, you know, it's back office stuff that has suffered throughout austerity. So there's a big piece for us, I think, about how we can really adapt some of that stuff, not take it slavishly, but use it to keep that pace and responsiveness and sense of real clear priorities.
Thank you, John. And I think that whole thing around clear priorities has been really crucial. So with the conversations that we had last year when people were in the midst of it, where we tried to analyse and draw out themes, what are the things that's making change during the pandemic different, and clarity was one of them. So I think previously people talked about, well, we want to do remote working, but it was all very, we just want to be flexible, and it was all very kind of woolly, and we were all talking about different things. So then people got lost in lots of detail of, well, how will I manage this individual staff? And then we never really got traction. But during the pandemic, it was everybody has to work remotely from Monday. So the level of clarity in that instruction then enabled us to marshal resources in a very different way than we had before, when we were sort of playing at it. So I do think clarity is crucial. Andrew, what are your reflections on?
Well, God, a lot. Very, very good inputs there. I think the role of the leader, that's positional leader, I suppose, chief exec coming in, and leaders across and down the organisation. Everyone's a leader of their own. I mean, we all get the right socks on each foot to go to work in the morning and get the right bus, and you don't turn up to work and then stop being a leader of, you know, situation. You've got kids to school or the dog fed. We're all good at, we have to organise ourselves. So not assuming people will be good leaders of themselves when they get to work is a bad bit of policy. But I think the pace, you know, John talked about pace and urgency, and the crisis allowed us to cut through a lot of the kind of, well, have we got a policy for that, and where's the last agenda? And, you know, not saying those aren't important, but local governments are sort of people that, you know, would probably do a very good Olympic stadium for 2012, but deliver it in 2013 and miss the point that it was actually needed a year before. We would get a perfect example, but it would be too late. And I'm saying that, who's been in local government for years and years, so I'm criticising myself. So I think clarity is brought forward by leaders at different points, saying this is how it is out there, and this is what we need to do today, and these are the tools we need now, not what we can do next week. We'll do next week, and we'll take personal responsibility for leaving some of those things that might be a little bit uncertain. And, you know, the executive councillor or portfolio wants the answer now, but you have to take responsibility for pacing those things and sort of giving people enough to get on with. So I think leadership, and I'm reminded, John and Beverly reminded John of VUCA, which is, I think, a military term, which is volatile, uncertain. I think, is it chaotic and ambiguous? And what you have to turn that into is clearer, you know, consistent. And I think that's a military term, which is positive uncertainty. You don't know what's around the corner, but you can't assume it's bad, because you don't want to kind of take your gun out to a child in the street in the middle of Afghanistan. It could be someone that's just playing in the street, but you've got to anticipate. So I think leadership and clarity, and you bring a sense of where are we in this to your team, and be very honest. And Beverly's mentioned relationships. You've got to trust that your team are adult enough to get things done. You will know where people aren't happy, and they'll tell you, and perhaps you can give them something different to do. And some leaders come from below and can be elevated in a time of crisis to actually do jobs that they were always wanting to do. And I think it is about future service design around those people. Back to Beverly's point about relationships with your communities, who are often intelligent enough to know and organise themselves. And a lot of the community groups have been absolutely fantastic. And all we've done is perhaps orchestrated those. Trust, leadership, permission. Permission is a very limited word. You have permission to do this and I'll take responsibility with you. I'm delegating it to you. I'm not dumping it on you. And I think where I came into Cambridge, a lot of the service managers, that's 13 or 15, I'm not used to dealing with so many, very service silo specific, felt that service design was just about them, not the whole organization. So I think a sense of leaders bringing in a sense of the whole organization to the organization, because customers don't see the planning service. They may, I've never applied for a planning permission. We think we have 17 different customers across 17 departments. We don't. We have a single customer that's getting through their day, and they may need you and they may not. So I think a sense of the customer, but also a sense of ourselves in the round. And I think the SCGs, TCGs, internal communications, all tended to help blend that sense that you're one organization dealing with a plethora of problems out there, which were community, business, sometimes those weren't the same issues. Members wanting to know where, you were handling a community of interest in members saying, what do I say to the press when, the coast rates have gone up to 300, So I think leadership is really tested in these times. And I think you've got to trust the people because the leaders can't do it all. It's not about dictatorial. It's about harnessing the natural abilities of many, but not everyone, and admitting that not everyone's up for this. And I think for the future, many people will come with us and many won't come with us, but they'll be made available to industry to be great somewhere else. And they may be relieved that they're not having to do the job that they were actually telling you they felt they weren't able to do. But there's a good reason why they didn't stop doing it, because they wanted to pay the mortgage. But I think an honest conversation about who's with us and we'll come back later on the shape of the organisation for the future, but those people that come with you are tested and come forward through these crises. Let's not lose that. Let's roll that into the future, into the more, perhaps less, VUCA's always with us, because what about the next pandemic? Or in Bolton or in Bedford, the case rates go up. We're not going to be off duty for another 6 months, a year, if that. So the idea we've just finished it, when we all can go on holiday, perhaps this summer and not in the winter. Local government's in this mode for several months, years ahead, and it's going to change the complexion of what we prioritise. For instance, just to leave you with one example, here's a paradox. Cambridge City earned £10 million a year on parking. During lockdown, it had no one parking because we didn't want anyone coming to the city. So we've got a massive income line essential to the council's resources based on a sort of a 20th century version of society, that people will come into the city. It's a tourist place. They'll pay 10 quid a session and we'll pay for services doing that. Well, we don't want people to use the car because we want to get on the bike, because it's climate change city and it's very, very strong on that. But we've got massive physical assets geared into 10 million quid return a year. What if that's 5 million in the future, or 3 million? What if we don't want anybody to park at all? What will we turn them into? So you can't go forward thinking that those things, they're natural paradoxes of COVID's thrown up. Back to this point, it's pressure tested the purpose of organisation. And one thing, I quote something in LinkedIn, I said that a minister was overheard to say, well, local government's quite good at this, aren't they? About the local test and trace, which we were better at, and local knowledge, and Beverly's point about relationships. You knew where things were. And they had to need a crisis to work out that we were quite good at holding the ring for local communities. And I think that's something to hold on to for the future, that we're good at this. Maybe we need to be more integrated. And, we did more integration overnight with our county partners and the health partners than we did do 30 years before. I mean, who sat in these policy agenda meetings, going, let's look at the public sector reform agenda, and everyone's looking at it thinking, well, our budgets are set. It's a nice, not the biscuits were nice and a cup of coffee, and then you go away and do the thing you were going to do anyway. But this has really shaken that up and helped build relationships with people we've never worked with before, chief execs of counties, health teams, public health, fantastic. Let's not lose that. But how does that integrate, even if you aren't going to do a unitarisation in Lancashire, or you are, how do you keep the spirit of that relationship going? I know I'm waffled on a bit, but there's a few thoughts there. It's paradoxical, but deal with the paradox as if that is what you're dealing with. Not when it goes back to everything in order, we'll be okay. And then we can put a PDF up and we can have a project owner, and we can have 53 pages of project onboarding. Who cares in the crisis? Just, is it working? As you say, does it work? Sorry, blah, blah, blah.
Thank you, Andrew. Definitely, what are your reflections on learning from the pandemic and how we might do change differently going forward?
Yes, so I obviously agree with a lot of what Andrew and John has said. And just again to reflect on the sort of Haringey experience, we have a sort of separate transformation team, which is made up of all the project managers that have been supporting our sort of change projects. But I think during our COVID response, that kind of faded into the background. And as Andrew and John has reflected, actually there was real distributed leadership in terms of change throughout the organisation. Social workers on the front line, day service workers delivering packages and medicines to residents in the community. And that didn't take an awful lot of organisation, but it met the need that was required. It was a crisis response. So part of our thinking is really, how can we keep the good parts of our crisis response in terms of our thinking about recovery and renewal and what needs to happen? So already we are looking at how we can more closely integrate our transformation officers into what I call the nuts and bolts of the work that we do on an everyday basis. The other thing that I just really want to bring out, if we are touching on things of leadership, is how we really need to support diversity of thought and contribution throughout the organisation. So I mentioned really earlier around equalities and how COVID sort of lifted the lid on the significant inequalities. We can't talk about leadership without reference to the Black Lives Movement's resurgence last year and the impact that has had on the conversations we are having within our systems. And certainly in London, and certainly in our sub-region and NCL, what we've done as a system, whether it's our trust partners, primary care, local authorities, the various components, we've come together through listening to our communities in response to the really important issues that were raised during COVID. And actually are working with them to agree 9 points of action to take forward that are going to be monitored by the chief exec, which focuses on how we address the significant inequalities in our system, whether that be through the workforce. I've mentioned, the communities and the deprivation within that. But I think that whole system's coming together is something that would not have been able to happen at the speed and pace that it has post-COVID. There is something very different around the conversations that we have been enabled to have around supporting diversity and inclusion at every level within our system. And I go back to the point about equity. We have to, as a system, rebuild with equity in mind. Equalities doesn't do it for me. It has to be equity. How do we focus our finite resources on the areas and the people that really need it most? And certainly in terms of the work that we're doing in Haringey, I should have said earlier, my other hat is I'm corporate lead for equalities, diversities and inclusion. And that's obviously going to influence a lot of my thinking and reflection. But certainly a lot of the work we're doing is to focus on how we can engage with our workforce. And we have really well established staff network groups, which are self-managing, self-organizing. I just happen to chair the sort of steering group. But I think that we mustn't, when we're talking about leadership, we mustn't forget the influence and the leadership within our own workforce, within our various organizations, and how they can support that diversity of thought and inclusion and help us to rebuild going forward. And again, that is systems thinking. I was at a meeting yesterday where we regularly come together as partnerships within the sub-region to actually share good practice around how we can support diversity of thought and inclusion going forward. So again, that is a big takeaway from our COVID response here in Haringey, as I'm sure it is in other parts of the country.
Thank you, Beverly. And I'm curious, John, because I know Lancashire quite well, and I know that, you know, the demography of Lancashire is just very, very diverse. There's parts of the council, parts of the county that, you know, are very deprived. There are parts that are actually quite wealthy. There are different communities with different needs in different places. How is that going for you guys? Because I'm sure that as it has it everywhere, it's really, COVID has really shone a spotlight on those kind of inequalities in different places and between different groups of people.
Yeah, so in two halves, I guess. So kind of most immediately thinking about what Beverly's just said in terms of organisational stuff. First of all, Beverly, I'd be really interested to speak to you afterwards about that 9-point action plan and just have a conversation about that, because I think organisationally, absolutely, we recognised with Black Lives Matters last year and kind of, you know, recognize that inflection point, I guess, across the UK, across the world, and thought and that something needs to be different, not just the usual stuff. And so I you know, I've got to be completely honest about that. That's been really challenging, because I think we are really good. I think it was Andrew talking earlier about, yeah, it was, wasn't it? You know, we built a brilliant 2012 stadium, but unfortunately we delivered it on the 1st of January 2013. We're really good at being slow about stuff, and sometimes that's for very good reason. But a lot of the times it just gets in the way, and I worry slightly that we're focusing on the nuts and bolts, on things like the res, and understanding our data, and not getting fast enough into actually taking some visible action and making stuff different. So I think that's a challenge for us. Taking outside the organisational focus, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's been, I would say probably Lancashire has been one of the areas where that impact of exclusion, of underrepresentation, of inequality, you know, of everything that Marmot talks about has been most stark. We've been in lockdown for pretty much the entire time. Our rates are increasing, thankfully. I mean, I watch Bolton with absolute horror, really. I'm a Bolton resident. I worked in Bolton for 23 years. And, you know, it's awful to see what's happening at the moment. But we are, you know, we're at some tipping points in Lancashire as well. There's some worrying signs. We've got to be incredibly careful. We're not out of this till everybody's out of it, and we're definitely seeing outbreaks. We're definitely seeing new variants. I think for us, one of the major challenges will be how we take everything that we've seen, all of the impacts, and use things like the genuine risk of enduring transmission in Lancashire. We've got 3 really, really focused, deliberative, thoughtful DPHs who are pushing everybody really hard about these kinds of issues of inequality. But again, that's the challenge. It's back to that piece about knowing it on a chart, understanding it in your heart, but somewhere making something different happen. So how do we actually turn all the discussions that we've had over many, many years, not just here, everywhere, about inequality, about economic development, about improvement, about strengthening our communities, into something that really makes a difference for those people who are most deprived and are feeling the impact of this pandemic far more than other groups.
Thank you, John. And I think what I'm seeing across local government, taking on board, Andrew, what you said about that, it's acknowledged that we are better at this than most. We are closer to our communities than most in local government. I've seen a shift of being even closer, even better, even more responsive. And I do really hope that continues. That feels like that kind of forming more meaningful relationships, because we are guilty, I think, of trying to oversimplify services and make them much more kind of consistent. And in actual fact, in some cases, you need services to be much more responsive and different. We sort of want to make everything consistent and the same. And we did have a question.
Lucy, could I come in on that? Just, I'm pretending we're around the table drinking coffee and sort of interrupting, as I'm used to doing. So I'm thinking a lot about this. I think councils, I mean, let's say it, that's a good thing. We're the only democratically elected body to do these things. We might argue about what tiers and structures, but we've got a fantastic democratic legitimacy. We need to be more inclusive and look at our residents and businesses as customers, as not just citizens who get what, we can only afford to give you this. It doesn't work, but here it is, to design around customers' real lives led, as Beverly was saying, and the fact that it's not equal and we need to provide for everyone. And Cambridge has some of the most deprived wards in the country, even though it looks like, Dreaming Spires and Town and Gown. That's why the Labour councils and Lib Dems very, very much focused on bringing better access for those wards that have don't have access to what you think Cambridge, the rest of the residents seem to have, and very high house prices. But I've been thinking about councils as a platform, not council as that place where you have to go up and get your ticket and wait in the queue. I mean, most councils haven't done that for a while, hopefully. Just waving a little finger at all of you to think that you've stopped doing that. But a platform to promote honest debate about, as Beverly says, about inequities, to include people underneath the shield of the platform. We've got structure, we've got scale, we've got buildings we will need to repurpose. We've probably got buildings we won't ever reoccupy. We've got facilities, we've got expertise. Lucy, you opened this by saying councils are amazing. There's about 250 services in every council. You've got land use specialists, you've got people who understand mutes, you've got people that understand air quality, social care, the most amazing array of scientists and social scientists and just brilliant people. But that platform can foster social enterprise underneath it, because we can take some of the heavy lifting around structures, places, financing, but to not see ourselves as just the bloody council. We are, in recent years, the council that did turn up with the food parcels, that did orchestrate was it millions and billions? I don't know, John, you probably, as a county, I mean, the amount of billions of business grant that we funneled in, and we had to fear of, the old, we'll deliver it in 2013 because the auditors told us, or the members were very fearful about risk. We took a better blend of risk. We knew it wasn't risk-free, but we had a risk appetite. So the platform is a democratically legitimate, or structure entity, but underneath which there's much more diversity and a growth underneath the platform that gives conditions in which things can happen that wouldn't have happened if we were just the council that picked up the bins and told you no about the planning application. I mean, government's probably going to sweep planning out of the way because it wants to build on in the field that you're looking out of now from your Zoom window, probably. But I think council as a platform does start to not just a commercial platform, because obviously we're a nexus for information, for understanding where our communities are, understanding where the voices that aren't being heard. I mean, you think of do you remember the homelessness issue in the crisis? How do you vaccinate people on the street? We had a fantastic thing where most of us had funds to put clean quality housing for people on the street. Are they going to go back on the street? What sort of platforms for third sector? So I'm quite interested in how the future is someone we're always ready and on, because we're in emergency mode because it could be something else that says we need local authorities to step up, not least social unrest or, housing, so on. And I just think that could be where some of those shifts, those pivots that John and Beverly are talking about happen. I'm not saying politically that members drawn from the 19th century, a lot of them in their thinking, some of them are actually as old as the 19th century, male, pale and stale as the old adage, are probably a little bit different from the recent elections, and many cities are different now. Younger councillors coming through, younger leaders now in many rural districts. That's fantastic. But we need some of those thinking to change along with the managerial thinking, but also the community think about what sort of council do we deserve. And that's the question that isn't often being asked in these sort of top-down structures. You get, you know, in charge of the council, you inherit the kind of chain, the gong of death or whatever, and you feel you have to uphold the council that was 20 years ago because of all the crests and the tables and the isms and osms. But I think that's where I'm thinking is council as a platform for, because we're here forever. We can't not be here. Look at Northamptonshire, there's still a council there. Liverpool, there will be a council after Liverpool. Liverpool now is gone and Liverpool in the future inherit. You can't not have one because we need a demo. You know, if we were a parish council, we'd have to probably form, hey, Beverly, John and Lucy, let's organise ourselves in this village. I mean, I spoke in Australia 2 years ago in Queensland, and I met the chief exec of a community, and I said, you know, on the Gold Coast, it was very nice in the hotel on the Gold Coast. And I was talking blah about transformation, Aylesbury, blah, blah, and a lot of people going, wow, it won't happen here. Although it is happening here. And I think John Ravlick's on the call from Australia. You know, some of the cost pressures are happening. And the chief exec came from a small community in Queensland, but she'd taken 2 days to get to the venue. Actually, she didn't fly, she doesn't believe in flying. And in the community, there's about 300 people, because even with 300 people, you need a structure, you need someone for water, you know, petrol. Actually, the guy who runs a petrol pump is the leader, which means that he gets his way because you don't get filled up if he doesn't like it, sort of thing. But even in small communities, you end up having to provide a leader, a set of people say, well, I'll do the toilets and you do the post, and there's a vegetable van that visits every 2 weeks. You know, there's no structure there, but they're living out in the desert areas. So we would have to organise ourselves. So we'd have to have legitimacy and we'd have to trust one another. So if you just scale it up to a council, why do you have all this dysfunctionality? And kind of, you have to say what I think you need to say. And remember, it's truth and power. And the best thing I learned on the new chief execs course was, you're not recruited for your obedience, you're recruited for your judgment. And many chief execs still struggle with this. They feel they need to be obedient when they actually still need to make judgments. And sometimes judgments are hard to hear. Sorry, I waffled on. I've interrupted and I'll shut up now.
It's fine. I hadn't thought of local government in those terms, that it would exist regardless. So that's a really interesting perspective. Thank you. I did just want to ask, because we did get a couple of questions from people as they were registering, and one of them is quite closely linked to what we were talking about around, you know, changing that relationship with communities, and that is, how can local government shift to placing empowering communities and an enabled state at the heart of every action? Does anybody want to have a bash at that? That's a very big question. Beverly?
Yeah, I don't mind having a start, because it's a very valid question, I think, for where we are in Haringey now and thought processes. And I mentioned earlier about the plethora of change programs across the council and with partners, and how we, through Haringey Connects, are trying to get a consistent methodology for the how we enact change. And I think, for me, that is a fundamental question to ask across a range of different considerations. How do we lead? We've had quite a discussion around leadership. How, you know, diversity of leadership, distributed leadership. How do we connect with our communities in anything that we do, whatever the change program? How do we work together? How do we maximize resources? These are just examples around how we might answer the how question. And what we're trying to do corporately through the sort of Haringey Connects work is to get that sign up and that ownership in terms of the how. And I think once we've got there, then I think we can be more confident in a consistent sort of approach in terms of interaction with our residents, engaged in them in co-production, working closely with them. So I'll just give you this very quick example. I was at a corporate board discussion not too long ago, and there was a housing strategy that was, presented. And I suppose my reflections were, well, actually, if the thinking we were doing now about change had happened at the time that strategy was being developed, actually, it probably would look very differently. It would look more about the impact on people, our residents, in terms of the housing outcomes, rather than the sort of the building and the infrastructures. Equally important, but there was something missing for me. So I think through the work we're doing in Haringey, trying to get that consistent approach, the responses to the how and the sign up and the ownership for the how, and it's very much hopefully a iterative process, and people will sign up to it. It's nothing that will be imposed. So we have this set of principles. Some people may call it a charter, but if it's a charter, it's not something that's going to be drawn up and put in a cupboard, and it's got to be a live document. And I think, in answer to your question, that would certainly be our approach here in Haringey. Thanks.
Thank you. And we've also had a couple of questions around kind of digital stuff. So do we think the acceleration of digital will impact on local government service delivery, and around the spend to save mentality around digital transformation? Do we think that'll carry on after the challenges of 2020? One thing that I'm particularly interested in is if we're saying that we think the future of local government is becoming much more responsive to communities. I've seen in a lot of organisations, when digital programs happen, they often focus very much on standardizing, because the driver's very much around reducing cost. Andrew, I know this is an area that you're really passionate about. Is there a tension between those two things? If we're going to go much more relationship focused, but yet we also want to improve digital, how do we bring those two goals together?
Well, I don't want to stop John. I think I've had two goes, but I don't think there is a tension if you accept that things change all the time. Often we say, oh, there's going to be a tension because we want these sort of institutional digital instruments to reduce our cost to serve, because we want to go web chat, whatever, because it's good for the organization. Assuming that the community has just stuck in its sort of 1983 ways of, oh, well, I haven't got a computer, I'm never going to use one. I think generations move very quickly. I think if you think of it in that we want to use the technology that our customers are using. So increasing, there's a very flat sort of, if you take iPhone use across the demographic, it's completely flat. It's not like, if you're very wealthy, you have 7 iPhones, and if you're not, you don't have one at all. Many people don't. Many wealthy people don't. I mean, it's a choice. But I think increasingly generations are moving towards, in COVID, if you couldn't or get access to the website, if you couldn't ask someone or be told or suddenly get enabled, like a lot of our staff never use Teams. I used to moan about how few councils are in the cloud, and they're still trying to peddle massive sort of servers in the basement and have 15 people with sonic screwdrivers trying to fix everything in Lancaster Centre, and everyone's trying to manage their own thing. Whereas the cloud, 365 is in the cloud. So it's quite deeply ironic that everyone accepted Teams overnight, as John mentioned, and then said, well, I'm not going cloud, it's too expensive, but it saved the day. But our customers are all, many of them, many, and increasingly the case as generations change, are moving to, if you can get an iPhone 4 from CX in the high street, that's how you organize your day. Your childminder, many, not everyone, but increasingly across the demographic, across the kind of age and income generations, they are organising their day through some sort of means of digital. And the council needs to be able to reflect their use of the technology. They need you for when they need you. They need the answer in the next 20 seconds, not 3 days, not providing 14 bits of paper. It's got to integrate with how, as Beverly says, our customers, not just the ones that have at the kind of end of the social fabric in terms of not having access, but the ones that are freely accessible but think, well, why do I pay Haringey any money because I only have the bins? Those people are very wealthy. They're very wealthy in edges of Lancashire that think, well, the council's never done anything for me. They're all constituents that the politicians need votes for, and everyone has a view, and they have a rightful view on it. And I think we need to be where the customers are, Beverly's point, in their time. So we're not saying, can you wait? Like, I mean, you wouldn't wait to get your car insured more than about 20 seconds. If I haven't forgot the car insurance, I'm going to drive it tomorrow, you can get it in. And believe me, insurance is where there's a lot of risk. They have to evaluate who John Morrissey is, you know, what's his driving history, is it insured? They have to do that in the back office, but John then gets his insurance from the best provider within milliseconds. Now, just because you're a council and you're the platform and the only council in the area and you can't choose your council, if you're in Haringey, you're in Haringey, doesn't mean you have to make people wait as long as our risk appetite wants us to. We have to work in the time that that person's got. So I think digital is about how people see the benefits of moving. If you have 5 things you've got to do today, you've got to get the kids to school, you've got to get the bus to work, you've got to have, something, you've got caring and responsibilities, 5 things that you really on your list, and some of those the council's responsible for, and 3 things are nice things. I want to go to the library, get a book, or go to a shop. We've got to satisfy those needs. We haven't got to say, can you just wait because my department can't do that, because the customer is waiting for those resolutions, and they are voting on, when it comes to voting, how the council dealt with that compendium of things that apply to me personally, not everyone in the street, now, in my time and in my day. And I think the best councils are trying to gear their services around that avatar, if you like, of what Andrew Grant needs today, and it isn't what Lucy needs in the same street or the same city, and trying to gear us. And that will save costs because it will be tailored, it will be just in time, it will just be only when it's needed. You won't have an inventory of stock in the so-called kind of council warehouse of stuff, legacy systems that are churning information that are only useful to the council. And actually most council staff never read the data that they've got anyway. In fact, Splunk, who's one of these sort of data analytic companies, which is a name that you'll remember, it's got apparently a technical name, but they call it dark data. It's not the dark web, it's dark data. Most councils only see about 3% of the data they've got and use it. They're not using most of the data that are freely given in GDPR to us to help target, analyze, predict, provide in people's spaces. We're providing like 15 goalkeepers across the goal, just in case something goes in the corner up there or down there, not one goalie that can predict where the ball's going to go. I wish I had that and spot the ball competitions when I was a kid. It was always never where you thought it was going to be, was it? Because they do want to pay the money out. But basically, you predict and provide for things that are only going to happen when your data's telling you. I don't know, in Manchester, if there's Man City versus Man U, I don't know, or take is that Lancashire? That's the right sort of thing. They know which pubs are going to kick off pre-COVID, 2 hours before the match, and the police will police those pubs where they know those things because of all the predictabilities. But councils, this is back to my 2013 Olympics thing, tend to think, well, we'll need 15, street wardens because of COVID everywhere, just in case something goes wrong in a park where there's actually no bugger there, because we hadn't looked at the CCTV footage. That's where we will narrow our costs. And also it'll be better, it'll be more satisfying services if we're tailored to how people live their lives using the technology they use, and us finding systems to meet that, not saying let's have a brand new system that the housing officers have decided is brilliant. It's all based on a server in the basement. It's based on legacy software, and actually all your customers hate it because it's not, as Beverly says, people shaped. It's system service shaped. And I've got a word for it. ICT doesn't mean information computer technology. It means institutional technology. It means the blue screens that the council thought was good, which is actually about 100 years old thinking. It's not where your customers are. And think of COVID as rapid development of customer change. People are staying at home, not going out. Where are they? How do we get to know where they are? How do we get to know where the auntie is? If the niece has got the phone, perhaps they can go around the auntie's house. You can find ways around it. But we need to gear to how people live their lives in real time and in reality. And as Beverly says, our versions of our customers are customers we've made up that look like us, not look like what the communities are.
Thank you, Andrew. So I guess the magic is make the digital so good so that you can focus on the relationships.
Exactly.
Together. We have a question just on the topic of data from Louise, which is, are there any further reflections on how to avoid paralysis and getting stuck in data and analysis when you don't have a pandemic to make us brave enough to take action? John, do you have any reflections on that? And can I just
sorry, go on.
Put other questions in. We are open for questions, so do please post your thoughts in the chat room and we'll pick them up. Sorry, go on, John.
Maybe less around the specifics of data, but about that risk of paralysis by analysis. And I think that's partly what I was referring to on the back of what Beverly was discussing earlier in terms of equity, equality, and those discussions that we're having at the moment. But also back to the piece around our emergency response and some of that ability of emergency planning colleagues, because I do think that's a core strength for them. I headed up emergency planning as part of my brief in Bolton, and obviously been fairly involved in it since I moved to Lancs. I think they have methods for helping us translate strategic intent into action. And I think that's the key. There will always be that temptation for us. Failure is very difficult in the public sector. Public failure is difficult for anybody, but failure in a political environment is especially difficult. And I think we need to see what we can do to change some of that. How do we enable people to fail safely, fail fast, learn lessons, and acknowledge that something just isn't working and knock it on the head and move on to something different. I think so again, one of the reasons that we're looking at some of this guidance that the military have used is that ability, linked to what Andrew said earlier about kind of VUCA environments, to accept that we don't know everything, but to be really clear about what we want to achieve, and to have people are empowered to go and try and make it happen, and not worry too much about all of the bits in the middle. You know, the bit that was a real, when I started doing stuff around Armed Forces Covenant about 4 or 5 years ago and really engaging with military colleagues, the bit that was the brain changer for me was, traditionally I'd thought of that environment as a very command and control environment. You know, someone told you to jump and you asked how high. The reality of that in the modern day is, and I think it's not just the modern day, it's been there for a while, you're given a set of objectives. You know, you're told you need to be on the top of that hill at midday. You're going to start from here and there's going to be 6 of you. This is what you'll have. Get up there. Along the way, if you have these opportunities, you can take them. But otherwise, just make sure you're there at 12 o'clock. And it's not nailed down. It's not rigor. It's not inflexible. It's absolutely flexible. You train people, you brief them, you empower them, you trust them to get on with it. So it's not particularly around that data piece and how we avoid paralysis by data, but more widely how we take action even when we don't know all of the answers. I think there are lots of lessons we can learn from the pandemic, and as I say, they're about clarity of brief, clear strategic intent, and trusting people to get on and do the right thing. And people have said to me on a number of occasions over the past year, when things haven't gone quite right, there've been a couple of people who have always been reminding us, nobody comes to work to do a crap job. Everybody's trying their hardest. Everybody's doing whatever they can. If you give them the tools, they'll do their best. We've seen that.
They've got the right socks on.
Yeah.
They are doing the best. That's always been a value I've held true. Just, you know, most people want to do a good job, particularly in the public sector. So Charlotte, please could you run the second poll just to get some feedback from the audience about what their challenges are?
Lucy, before the question was data paralysis, I think over COVID there was a lack of data paralysis. we were told that health were meant to be giving us more than just general block information about vaccination uptake, because the concern at point was to get into penetrate areas to at least communicate better about the benefits of vaccine. And we hit one of those walls. You know, the protocols are even difficult between counties and districts and you know, third party. But health said they would, and the minister said you'd get it, and we never really got it. So I think actually councils don't look at their data in a structured way, and often data transfer is still one of those bête noires. GDPR aside, I think there's every reason why GDPR is often cited as a reason why you can't do something. Actually, there are very few rules that say it's just sensible risk acceptance. And I think hopefully in the future we will get better flows between trusted, you know, parts of, as Beverly says, the system. Hopefully we'll never not trust one another. In the past, I wouldn't have seen my director of public health 1 year to every 5 years. I've seen them 3 times a week and really enjoyed their stats. And we got some fantastic overall, what they call intel from their cells, as they call them. But we didn't really get anything that useful. We had to door knock to find out in the end, which was probably a bit kind of ham-fisted with a sophisticated way. And maybe in future with telehealth and digital, you know, means we'll be able to, with permission, know to target isolated people better. And not have all this wasted inventory of checking, which I think we still do. Sorry to interrupt.
I think you're right, and I think as well that a lot of paralysis isn't to do with the data at all. It's a cultural thing of just not feeling confident making decisions, and I think during the pandemic we just didn't have the luxury of time, so people had to make decisions quickly. Beverly, I don't know what your reflections are on decision making during the pandemic.
No, absolutely, Lucy, I'd agree with that. I think a lot of the barriers fell away, and you know, we got increased data that was really important. For example, in my area on the clinically extremely vulnerable, which we know is going to be really important in terms of our planning, in terms of early intervention and prevention, in terms of minimizing the need for critical care later on. So it is really an important tool to enable us to plan. But I really think that a lot of the sort of red tape that is usually sort of surrounds sort of engaging and sharing appropriate data did fall away, and it did allow us to make much more improved decisions. And public health, I totally agree with Andrew. I think we will all within our authorities look very differently at the role of public health, and it's really brought into the spotlight the need for that focus on the wider determinants of health and that whole population health focus. So that can only be a good thing. Thanks.
Thank you. So we have a really big question here from Freddie, which I don't know who to ask this question. Do you think areas with devolution or metro mayors have dealt with the local government response to the pandemic better compared to other areas? I might start with you, John, because I know you've worked at Bolton for a long time and then come across Lancashire. I'd be interested.
Yeah, I was going to volunteer anyway. I think the short answer, Freddie, is no. I'm still close to people in GM. I live in GM. I watch what's happening, and I've been obviously intimately involved in what's been going on in Lancs, as an example. I haven't seen anything that suggests the response has been any better or any worse, actually. And I think a lot of our response has probably been down to the strength of local relationships rather than those more aggregated up. Andy Burnham, as an example, has been a really strong figurehead and very vocal across GM and has provided a great deal of leadership. But I know the reality of the way GM operates is, so when I was working in GM and we got health devolution, the first question that everybody who came to see us asked was, "This is amazing, how have you got this partnership together so quickly? And how's it been so effective? What did you do to make this start working?" And the stock answer was, we started in 1989. When we formed AGMA, the Great Association of Greater Manchester Authorities, we then spent many years arguing with each other about what was working, what wasn't working. But we built trust, we built understanding, and some of that trust was about, I'm going to be really open and say I distrust you on this. So those relationships will have helped to smooth the way. But I think Dean's probably dropped off the call now, but if it's the same Dean Langton that was on the call, who is our chief exec in Pendle, I think the value of those local relationships has been really important. Because, and one of the examples I'll give is when we were looking at how we're going to really get people to take up on lateral flow testing pre-Christmas, when we started that pilot that became the kind of national provision, we knew that we had significant outbreaks in a big employer in the borough in the district next to Dean's. And we were really trying to work out why we just weren't getting any engagement and any take up on that lateral flow testing. And Dean's Oppo, the chief exec there, was able to say to us, right, I've spoken to the chief exec of the company. So this is a big company, 4,000 people working, massive sort of mail order company trying to get everything out before Christmas. And what that local intelligence and discussion with the chief exec of the company told us was, everyone here is on a £1,500 bonus if they don't take any days off between now and Christmas. So if they take the test and they're asymptomatic and we have to send them to a self-isolate, they're 1,500 quid worse off. They're not going to do it. That's what's paying for Christmas. And then we were able to start getting into discussions about, well, for example, does it make a difference if we guarantee their bonus? If you're positive and we have to send you home, we'll sort the bonus out, but we need you to do the right thing, because we had a parallel employer in another part of the county who we went really engaged in testing. Yeah, come and get in. Similar number, 3,000 employees. We'd been there a day and we found 160 positive cases, and you know, things were in danger of falling apart. So I think Metro Mayor's devolution can help with relationships, can grease wheels, and I think there are, you know, I would say there are advantages of those arrangements, particularly in speaking with a single voice. But I haven't seen anything that suggests to me right here and now that it's been a big advantage or disadvantage in terms of a COVID response.
Thank you, John. I have to say, as a Lancashire resident, I do sometimes feel a bit envious of Greater Manchester, because Andy Burnham is great at being a champion for the area. And I'm part of an organisation called People's Powerhouse, which is a community group that's driving a sort of better relationships with communities and then being more involved in power-based decisions. And I challenged Andy at an event of theirs. I lost my father to COVID, so I also try and represent the voice of bereaved families. And he answered, you know, to say what are mayors doing for people that have lost somebody to COVID, and he answered it exceptionally well. He's a great politician. You know, he's somebody that you do feel is championing the cause for the North. So on that level, I do sometimes feel a bit envious and wish we had, but like you, I don't know. I think sometimes the hands are a bit more tied than people realise in terms of how much power or how little power they have. Andrew or Beverly, do you have any views on this?
Well, we have a combined authority mayor. It's not a happy relationship in a county two-tier area. It's more around the growth agenda, although I think the outgoing mayor, who's now no longer mayor following the election, had a particular, I think he tried to be the Andy Burnham of the East. I'm not sure if that's what worked through. I think it was very much focused on infrastructure and so on. And I echo John's point, and probably looking at the GM model from afar. I mean, the fact they were all unitaries was a good start. When you try and do it in a two-tier area, I can see the frustration of the mayor in any political party, trying not getting their arms around all the actors and actresses in this space. I think there's a lot of emphasis on recovery and business recovery with the funding that's gone into the combined authority. It's really got no purchase on the kind of things that we've been talking about this morning. You know, the EHOs going in, door knocking on pubs that want to open around the back streets and shouldn't do, or LFT tests. And I really echo John's point about working with public health on, in our case, in East of Cambridgeshire, there's a lot of migrant workers sharing vans to pick vegetables, to go together working, or often accommodated together. If they don't work, they're on a day rate, or if they can't guarantee their slot is maintained, if they isolate, they wouldn't do a test. And I don't think the mayor had any bearing on that, you know, so probably not the best mayoral model to reflect. Maybe the London mayor might have more influence, but you know, standing up for Cambridgeshire is one thing, but actually getting the job done was usually us down at the bottom, sort of scurrying away. So I'd say.
Thanks, Andrew. Beverly, do you have any views?
Not from a comparative perspective, but just from our experience here in London, it's been very much one of collaboration and support. I sit on regular sort of health and care strategy meetings with mayor representatives, and it's always been very collaborative and supportive. But I don't feel I'm able to comment on comparisons with other authorities. Thanks.
Thank you. So the poll results have come in. The biggest challenge, the one with the most votes, was not sure how to change, which we can certainly help with that. So do get in touch with us if you're struggling with that. The second one, which is no surprise, is that lack of resources to deliver the change. We are looking to run another one of these events specifically around the delivery of change and what kind of resources and capacity you do need, because we do see that as a very common issue working with local government. We have got a few questions coming in now. So we have one from James, which is, how do we ensure the different personality types in our organisations are supported in the new world? Which I guess is about treating people very much as individuals, which I think from my perspective, I've seen a lot of learning around that, of kind of taking a more human approach to change leadership, which is really positive. So how do we acknowledge the different ways that people absorb information and make decisions, and is this a challenge? So maybe to summarise that, how have you found that as a more kind of taking a more empathetic and human approach to leadership during the pandemic? Who would like to take that? John, you've just...
I'll have a crack if you like. I think so when I saw the question, I immediately jumped to some of the discussions that we've been having over the past 9 months or so about how virtual and remote working is impacting on people. So we've been very much thinking about making sure that we recognise one size won't fit all. So to be clear, we definitely don't think that a wholesale move back to offices is the thing to do, and we think that a hybrid model is much better. But in that hybrid model, there'll be some roles and jobs which perhaps have more time in an office than out of them, but we also recognise that there will be some personality types and personal situations that would move that slider as well. So we've got a tiny number of people in County Hall. I think looking at the background, Freddie is probably one of them, but we have certainly last time I looked at it, we probably didn't have much more than a couple of hundred people, where we would normally have had about, I think, 3,500 on the campus. Some of those people are back in because they're just having a really tough time at home, and some of that is people feeling really isolated or having really difficult personal circumstances. So I think what I'm really keen to keep pushing is people will be different. We need to recognise that difference, celebrate it, not look at it as a difficulty, look at what they bring to it. And I think it touches back as well on what Andrew was saying earlier about things like, you know, the insurance model, or the fact that, you know, in essence, we've all moved to fulfilling most of our needs through Tesco online and Amazon deliveries, haven't we, at this point, and it works really well. We need to recognise that everybody has a different set of needs. We can pull them in, we can make it work, but some of that can really work to our advantage. So we've had, I don't just mean in Lancs, I mean across my experience of local government, our contact centres largely have opened at 8:30 and closed at 5:30, even though they're almost all virtual centres now. So rather than looking at extended hours and people's desire to work flexibly as a challenge to us. Let's look at it as an opportunity and say, wouldn't it be brilliant if actually the fact that you're one of those people that's ping awake at 4 o'clock in the morning and is quite happy to take phone calls from people who might want them, or that you're working late into the night because you had to do some other stuff during the day, that's great. We can work around that and extend the hours that we're available to customers. So yeah, I think the challenge for us is perhaps taking that diversity and differences in personality types and desires and using that as a really positive thing, rather than in the old world we tended to look at that as a challenge to our policies and our ways of working.
I think it takes a bit of courage for leaders and managers as well, because I think people have a tendency to want to treat everybody the same, and that's what they think fairness is. So I do think it's a bit of a mindset shift for leaders and managers. Beverly, I've been working with Haringey and I've seen some really good stuff there around kind of proper meaningful engagement with staff to understand how people want to work. Do you have any reflections on this?
Certainly, I would really link this question and the response to mental health and well-being, and that's a specific focus I'm sure all of us have with our workforce at present. And as John has said, you know, working very differently over the last 12 months and preparing for the, you know, the lockdown easing and how we might go back into the office is very much a collaborative activity at present here in Haringey, in terms of understanding and recognizing the anxieties of some people around, well, actually, how am I going to make that move? I personally haven't been into the office for 12 months because I'm in a bubble with my elderly mother, and I'm feeling anxious around how do I make that first visit back to the office. But we are planning some team preparation days. We're very much looking at this hybrid, much like John has said, way of working. And certainly in my area, it's not so much really about going back to an office for a lot of my staff. It's very much about how do we have a presence in Haringey within our localities. So there isn't an emphasis on, you know, you need to get back to an office desk, etc. However that is organised. But I think the answer to that question is a focus on mental health and well-being, an acknowledgement that I've certainly, and a lot of people have missed those corridor conversations, those lift conversations, where very often you get so much done if you're not outside of a formal meeting. How do you recreate those kind of opportunities in this new kind of hybrid way of working? And I think the only way we can be fairly successful is if we talk to our staff, we listen to their needs, we are committed, supporting their mental health and well-being, and we have the right sort of resources to support that going forward. Thanks.
Thank you. So we have a quick question. I'm just really conscious of time now.
Lucy, could I just jump in on that? I think the question was about the long-term future of change, because it came off the poll. And I think the short term, I think that, as I say, I think we're in this for, I don't think we can say we're over it yet, because we'll, you know, like in most emergencies, once the blue lights have gone in, we sweep up the glass and, you know, move everything around and help. There's a long tail on this. What I would say is that people are very tired, they're exhausted. When I joined Cambridge, they were already flat on the floor, and we didn't know we had another 7 months of it. So I suppose there's a time to allow them to, it's a bit like coming out of the elections. You know, I hadn't, because I'm 62 next July, I can't party like I used to, and staying up all night and then all day, I've forgotten what it's like to keep awake for 40 hours unassisted. So I think people need space to recover because they're very tired and they're a bit bored and a bit flat. I mean, just talking COVID all the time, but also not to think, but it's a great opportunity. John mentioned earlier, it's a pivot time. It's not a time of saying, well, good, I can go back to counting all the files in the filing cabinet. I'm being a bit, pejorative. Because as Caroline, she's on the call, will know. Hi, Caroline, nice to see you. In Aylesbury, we decouple the idea of what you do technically to how you see life is in terms of your behaviours. The people you want to keep are the people whose behaviours are right. Whether they're doing the right job they think they should be doing or not, technically or not, you can teach anybody anything. I know you might say, the senior planner knows everything, and when they walk off, what will we do? Well, that's our fault for not, codifying what people know and sharing that. So what we did is a lot of work on change on on behavioural assessment centres, the whole council, 450 people. I know you might freak at that, but we did it because we wanted to, and most people passed, but they had to say, well, what is it about you and your values and culture that fits the organisation we want to be? And then what do you want to do in the organisation? Be it, go from waste management to planning, or from low to high, or actually I've been over promoted too long. And that's where the stress is. I think if we just say, oh, let's get rid of COVID and go back to where we were, even if we don't fill the offices, and we can do all the jobs we really, really loved before, which most people didn't, because it was like silos and drain pipes, and I have to report to him or her, and he has to sign my paperwork off. All that has to change, because if we're going to be focused on customers and equity and people and real communities, then we have to reflect the way we're more agile. We're based on the behaviours and values that mirror the kind of society we're trying to support. And we're not sort of keeping people in their power towers any longer than, and most people are unhappy with that. There are very few people that are happy potentates sat in the office just barking orders all the time. That, a friend of ours, Caroline, and I will know who it is, coined the phrase, change the people or change the people. And to be very honest, you change the people in the sense that they move into being comfortable in the organisation that's around here. John will nod because he's the OD lead. Or you change the people in that they don't stay with you. Go and do something that's more fulfilling, that fills your heart with love and joy. And don't be miserable with us at the water cooler saying that John Morrissey's a real git. He doesn't know what he's talking about. I wish he'd go back to 1823 when it was all perfect. There was no golden age of local government when everything was perfect. So those people need to move. You need to help them move. You need to be generous in their moving. You need to say no, no bad feelings. It's back to John's point of, I don't trust you, but I want to, so how do we work on it? Not pretend that you trust each other. And then when you try and sign that document about it, it all comes out in a horrible mess. And I think change the people or change the people, you've got to be honest. Fairness is saying, look, I don't think you fit here, but how do I help you somewhere else where you'd fit better? We had people leave us who came back after 6 months saying, I can't find the place that I was telling you were horrible and I wanted to go and find a nice place, but I couldn't find one, so I'm back. Can I have another job? Well, thank you very much, no. But if you want to work with us, most people worked and stepped through it. And we can train for skills, but you can't train for attitudes. Either you've got them and it's right round here or it isn't. And I think local government stuff for the people that came in 1 year 30 times that aren't happy, but don't want us to change it because it's not like they want it. And I'm very brutal about that. And that's got to change, because we won't have any legitimacy. Certainly the politicians won't get voted in if we don't change with society. And it's not all about us. It's all about the customer, citizen, resident. It's not about us. But we spend years worrying about which rank we are. When you go to a dinner party or something, or meet, well, hey, do you ever say you work for the council? You probably don't. You probably say, I'm in land use specialisms, because that's better. But people then try to define you about what rank you are. And I'm benefited from being a chief exec, and I've enjoyed that. But it's about what I contribute to changing things, not how much sort of stripes I've got on. But local government's full of stripology. Or were you at the combined authority? Oh, what were you there? I was director. Oh, what are you now? So we've got to stop that, because there's this internal sort of self-referencing silos of, you're only as good as the kind of silo you're maintaining. And that, in my recipe, would have to be completely exploded and disrupted. Sorry, intervention.
Thank you, Andrew. We can always rely on you to I'm really sorry that we have run out of time, so apologies to the people who did submit questions that we've not been able to get to. I just wanted to say it's been a really valuable conversation, certainly for me. It's so interesting hearing different perspectives, especially from different types of councils and in different areas around the country, on what your challenges and your focuses are. So I found it hugely beneficial. So thank you hugely to all three speakers for your insights. In terms of next steps for us, if you've enjoyed this session, we wrote a white paper at the back end of last year, which is available for free to download on our website, which is around lessons learned of managing change during COVID. And I always feel really anxious when I say this publicly, but I am in the process of writing a book about what we've learned from the public sector for change. John, I really want to catch up with you separately for you to put me in touch with some people in the emergency services, because I don't actually have that perspective in the book, and I think that is a very interesting perspective. So I am looking for people to interview, so if you feel that you've had to change significantly during the pandemic and you'd be up for talking to me just for my research, then I'd be really appreciative of that. We have booked on, we've penciled in our next event, which is the 9th of July, and we want that event to be about putting it into action. So it's been a very reflective session this. The next session we'd like it to be very much how are we moving forward and putting all of this learning into action. Charlotte will post the link so you can book onto that now, but we'll add more detail in terms of what speakers. If you know some good speakers who you think would be brilliant, please do point them in our direction. We'd love to hear about your change priorities and challenges, and if you do need some extra help, you can book a free call with a member of my team. So if you're one of the people that said your biggest challenge is you're not sure how to change, you can book a free call as a thank you for attending this session, and we'll just have a quick chat with you about what your priorities are and how we might be able to help you, or maybe it's just a quick sounding board, because sometimes you do just need to talk some things through with somebody external, so do get in touch with us if you think that would help. So I'm going to close it, but I'm going to give each speaker just a 20-second words of wisdom. Summarize, what would your advice be to somebody leading change? Well, you're only allowed to say one thing. John, do you want to go first?
Be radical.
Be radical, I love it. Andrew?
Courage.
Courage, definitely. And Beverly?
Focus on change management.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Please do keep in touch with us, follow us on social media, and do book on our next event, pencil it in if you can, and we look forward to seeing you soon.
Thanks, Lucy.
Cheers,
Thanks,
all.
everyone.
Thanks very much.
Beverly.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.